All right, let's get started. Thank you everyone for joining us today. My name is Allison Akiko Oakley, and I'm the Vice President for Learning, Evidence, and Impact at the organization PACT. And I am the co-editor, together with Kate Kruger, of the special issue of the journal we will be sharing today. I am thrilled to be here with you discussing issues I find fascinating, but first let me note our co-sponsors. PACT, where I am currently today, is co-sponsoring this event with Georgetown University's master's program in democracy and governance. Many of the students and alums are actually DRG practitioners today, including many of you in the virtual room today. The director, Professor Elton Skindai, is also with us today and can take questions after if you would like to hear more. We're also co-sponsored by the American Evaluation Association's Topical Interest Group for Democracy, Human Rights, and Governance, which I believe is turning 10 years old soon. One of the co-founders, Rebecca U. Staten, is also an issue author and can correct me. Now, today we'd like to discuss the state of the field of democracy, human rights, and governance program evaluation. That continues to be a mouthful, so from now on, I'll refer to the acronym DRG or to DRG program evaluation. DRG program evaluation has, in many ways, been a residual category, defined more by what it is not than by what it is. Part of this is due to the relatively young age of this subfield of evaluation, but part of this is also due to the challenge of determining what to measure in a sector when goals can be highly politicized or intentionally focused on the reallocation of power. For this reason, we think it's time to take stock of how we're doing as a field. Are we providing the necessary function of monitoring, evaluation, and learning for the larger DRG sector? Are we keeping pace with the changing role of the evaluator, which has moved much more to the responsibility of being transformative or to seek social justice? These are just some of the questions that drove many of us almost 4 years ago to put thoughts on paper and propose a special issue of the journal, New Directions for Evaluation. The aim was to share what we've learned thus far as a sector, with a focus on the political nature of DRG program evaluation and the complexities we face, and all in the context of 16 years of global democratic decline and a growing public distrust in the ability of a democratic system to mediate conflict. Now, we do not pretend to have definitive answers. In fact, this issue is premised on the idea that our answers will change as our learning advances. But we hope this stimulates more critical reflection as a field to advance sectoral learning and improve programming. The publication is finally out 3 years later. Just last week, I received the hard copy. It's real. It has words and pages and authors and everything, even pictures. We're very excited. Congrats to everyone who was involved. I'm happy to say that many of the authors are here with us today and will be available for questions during the discussion period. I want to thank everyone for all the effort you put in, your patience with Kate and myself as we push this journal to completion just during the past few years of, high politics, closing civic spaces, COVID, even parenthood. Most of us have separate full-time jobs, and this was really a labor of love. So let me turn now to the agenda for today. We have a great lineup of speakers. Everyone has kindly agreed to keep to time, so while it's a relatively large panel, we've saved plenty of time for discussion with participants. We'd like to begin with the big picture and then focus on specific findings of some of the chapters. We'll first hear from Leslie Fierro, who is the outgoing co-editor-in-chief of New Directions for Evaluation and the Sidney Duder Professor of Program Evaluation at McGill University's Max Bell School of Public Policy. Leslie will situate the special issue in the larger literature of program evaluation and note some of the challenges of increasing author voices in publishing. Now, Leslie has officially passed the baton to the new co-editors-in-chief of New Directions for Evaluation. Our issue is the last one she oversaw, and we are very grateful that she could join us today. Then we'll hear from Thomas Carothers, whose work many of you have studied. Tom is Senior Fellow and Co-Director of the Democracy, Conflict, and Governance Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He's a renowned author on the topic of democracy, assistance, and democratization, and most recently published the book, Democracies Divided, The Global Challenge of Political Polarization. He is probably the best person with the broadest knowledge who can situate DRG evaluation in the larger democratization sector, and we are thrilled he could join us today. We'll then summarize what's in the journal and major trends and takeaways across the chapters, the main findings of 4 of the chapters, and Kate will introduce those presenters a little later. After that, we'll open it up to the audience questions and a discussion and close with some parting resources. Before we begin, let me note that you can ask questions using the Q&A option at the top of your screen. My colleague Caroline is helping to moderate that. Thank you, Caroline. So without further ado, let me pass things to Leslie Fierro to get us officially started. Leslie, over to you.
Thank you. And thanks to Allison and Kate for inviting me to say a few words at the beginning of this session. I'm really excited that this issue is out for all of you to see and to be here with you today to just share a few words and to hear from all the authors. For those of you who are unfamiliar with New Directions for Evaluation, it's a quarterly publication that's sponsored by the American Evaluation Association. NDE is essentially a special issue journal. So you can think of it as kind of a small book or akin to what you would see in a journal supplement or a special issue journal. So there's a guest editor or one or more guest editors. And they essentially pulled together several chapters from several different authors on a single topic, which is what you see here that Allison and Kate have pulled together. So Allison asked me to speak with you a little bit about what interested us, myself and my co-editor-in-chief, Todd Franke, about this particular issue. One thing is that we look for, and we did look for during our tenure with the journal, topics that were really timely, different, and things that hadn't been discussed in New Directions for Evaluation for quite some time. And so certainly this topic fell into all of those categories. And I want to read something to you because I think it summarizes really at a glance or quickly why we had a particular interest in this special issue in particular. And this is the second paragraph in the editor's notes of the journal. The role of DRG in the public mind has changed in recent years, influenced by 16 straight years of global democratic crisis and decline, along with movements that challenge the allocation of political power, such as Black Lives Matter and Me Too in the United States, and decolonize localized aid and international aid. Discussions about whether and how we reform democratic institutions are now commonplace headlines rather than niche topics limited to political scientists and DRG practitioners. Accordingly, this issue is relevant to anyone concerned with how our political institutions can manage political conflict and our role as evaluators in understanding and contributing to that process. Indeed, in the American Evaluation Association's guiding principles, evaluators are charged to, quote, contribute to the common good and advancement of an equitable and just society, end quote, including advancing a democratic society. And so that, in a nutshell, is why we were so interested in this journal issue. We feel that it touches on incredibly relevant topics, timely topics, and crucial topics in the evaluation field at the moment, both within the United States and globally. And we greatly appreciate the contributions that all of the chapter authors and Allison and Kate made to this. I think I'll leave it at that because I know you all want to hear from the chapter authors about what's in the journal, but of course, happy to chime in later and answer any questions. But great work to everybody, and I know that everybody will really enjoy reading through this issue.
Thank you very much, Leslie. Really appreciate your ushering us through this whole process. It's been quite a learning experience for all of us. I'd like to pass it now to Tom to take us away on the larger topic of democratization. Tom?
Thank you very much. Thanks for the invitation. It's great to be with everyone. I've been asked to speak about the evolution of the DRG sector over the last 40 years, the current state of the field, and what the implications of both the evolution and the state of the field are for the challenges of evaluation. So 40 years of evolution in 10 minutes. It's a fairly rapid tour, but I'm going to do my best, so stay with me here. So, how has the DRG sector evolved over the last 40 years? When the field of democracy aid emerged in the 1980s and early 1990s, it was populated by people who did not come from experience in using assistance to produce change in other countries. They were, for the most part, lawyers, political activists, politicians, political consultants, civic activists, and others. The fact that they had never really worked on trying to use aid to produce change in other countries gave them certain characteristics that were both a great strength and a weakness. Their strength was a tremendous amount of self-confidence. They knew what they wanted to do, and they went out and they did it. There was a lot of energy and dynamism in the field. The weakness was the same thing, tremendous self-confidence. They knew what they were going to do. They were not infused by empirical experience. They were infused by conviction. And as a result, they ran into some serious headwinds. Now, to understand the evolution of the field, I think a useful way to do it is look at the underlying assumptions that animated the field at the beginning. So I'm going to identify 4 of those. And I would note that whenever I talk about underlying assumptions of the field from a long time ago, sometimes people hear them and they say, oh, it can't be that people thought like that. Come on, you're exaggerating. Well, I'm sorry, they did. I was there, I was part of it. And these were assumptions at the time, not by everybody all the time, but they were prevailing assumptions. Let me highlight 4 and their implications for the field. The first was the idea of the naturalness of democratization as a process. The idea that once the hold of an authoritarian regime is broken, openness flows into a political system, almost like air coming into a room that was a vacuum before, and that it creates a natural process of political opening, an openness to democratization, and then a democratization process, essentially a boulder rolling down the hill. The implication of that belief was the belief that in such a context, the provision of knowledge about sort of how to do democracy is the primary task, that during the authoritarian period, people were cut off from knowledge about democracy, how it works. And so once you have this opening up, what you need to provide as an outside assistance provider is the knowledge, how to organize a political party, how to hold an election, how to organize a parliament, how to write a constitution, and so forth. So under this first assumption, the primary task of democracy aid in its initial conception was the provision of critical knowledge. The second assumption was that we, the democracy community, believed we had a model that worked. There was a sense of, we know what democracy is, we know what the endpoint should look like, we know what the critical institutions are, we know how they're supposed to function, so we know what we're doing. There was quite a bit of sense of certainty about that. Third, the democracy community was infused by the belief that there were no rival systems or actors working against the larger global democracy project. There were, of course, enemies of democracy within countries, but they were within the countries. There was not a sense of transnational rivalry or competition. So there was the assumption, from that assumption, the assumption that democracy aid had a natural place because nobody was really contesting it as an activity. And then fourth, there was the belief that market economic reforms, which were the big rage at the time, and democratization would go hand in hand, that the two would complement each other, as US officials always used to say, market reforms and democracy go together hand in hand. The democracy crowd wasn't really very interested in economics. They were political people, and they felt that politics would take care of economics, because once you got good politics, then politicians would gravitate towards sound economic policies and produce decent economic results. So those are 4 fundamental assumptions. And we can understand the evolution of the field as the adaptation to the crumbling of those assumptions. So let me quickly go through them and talk about what the crumbling led people to in their thinking about democracy aid. First, regarding the naturalness of democratic transitions. As we know well now, many attempted democratic transitions either went sideways or backwards over the last several decades. Sideways, when you got countries that had a fair amount of openness, they had elections, they have parties, they have civil society, they have some independent media, but they live in a state of very low democratic performance and very low sort of democratic stability. Think of Peru, for example, today. It has all of those elements, but it is in a constant democratic crisis. Or they went backwards. Elected leaders often dismantled the very institutions that had brought them to power in ways that we know about. I don't need to go on about that. There are many such examples today around the world, unfortunately. So the basic problem was that it turned out that lack of knowledge was not the critical problem. The critical problem was the reconcentration of power by people who, in context of political openness, would reconcentrate power in new ways for their own ends, often for anti-democratic ends, and that was the problem. So democracy aid providers have been on a long road towards thinking about democracy aid as an endeavor that tries to challenge concentrations of power, that tries to empower people in many different ways. So thus, a much greater focus on anti-corruption, because corruption is a form of entrenched power. A much greater focus in civil society work on building constituencies, helping citizen movements gain real power, on women's political empowerment as a way of empowering people, on helping technology serve to empower people rather than to disempower people, on helping investigative journalism operate, and so forth. And so this focus on power rather than on knowledge is one of the central elements of evolution. The second assumption, the idea that we have a model that works, once you take that away, there's of course the greater realization that you have to have horizontal learning about different models. And so aid has gone from export of an idea to exploration of an idea, from export to exploration. And the idea is we have to learn horizontally from each other within a region, across regions. We learn from them, they learn from us, a fundamental change in thinking about what democracy aid is. The third assumption, that there are no rivals, obviously has gone out the window, as we have Russia, Iran, China, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and other countries working across borders to affect political developments in other countries for their own interest and in their own ways that often butt up against democracy aid and a larger democracy project. This has meant that democracy aid has to become more defensive in its goals and often has to struggle to gain a place. Democracy aid can no longer assume it has a place, it has to fight for a place in countries where others are there doing other things against it. Finally, with respect to the assumption about economics and democracy, obviously that has fundamentally changed, and many are now questioning whether market economics really works against democracy rather than for it. And democracy aid has become preoccupied with this idea of, quote, helping democracies deliver, which is about realizing that economics is fundamental, is not being taken care of by democratization, and there has to be a much greater focus on economic change as a positive process that will actually contribute to democratization rather than work against it. So when we look at the field today, we see a field that is focused on the question of power, that is interested in the exploration of models, is acutely aware of competition and the need for protection and defense, and is profoundly interested in the relationship between economics and democracy in ways that it wasn't before. In a simple way, and I know this sounds a little bit flip, the field is much less secure, less self-confident, and in a way, in a better place than it was 35 years ago. And it is where we can kind of wish it had started 35 years ago, because that's the right mindset, I think, for this larger endeavor of trying to help other countries become democratic. Now, let me finish with a few words about the implications of all this for evaluation. When I identified the four assumptions, I could have identified one fifth one, which was a resistance to evaluation, because democracy providers early on felt, we know what we're doing, and you can't measure this anyway, because this is just different than economic assistance. That assumption has crumbled in parallel with the decay of other assumptions. And Alison Oakley has written elegantly about these many generations of change and thinking about evaluation in the DRG sector. But overall, the process of evaluation is now founded on the gradual realization that we do need to ask fundamental questions, that we do need to produce some signs of impact, given that many are questioning whether this field is worthwhile at all. And what I'm struck by now is really a Copernican revolution in attitudes about evaluation. I'm in meetings or I'm asked by senior people of one type or another with a kind of ferocious hunger, just tell me what works. We desperately need to know what works, because there's a strong feeling that a lot is not working. So we really, really need to know what works. So the field of evaluation is now based on this hunger rather than resistance. And this is really a fundamental change for the endeavor of assistance. So I hope that's been a useful overview to you. It's been a long road, the DRG sector, over the 40 years, and we're somehow only in the middle of this road. We don't even know if we're in the early middle or the late middle, but we're in the middle of it somehow. And despite all the difficulties and complexities, I actually think this is an exciting time for the DRG sector because we finally do now have the attitude of openness and acceptance of complexity and the need for new determination. I think this volume that we're talking about today will contribute to that, and I congratulate the authors and the editors for having made it happen and appreciate the invitation to speak to all of you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tom. You've teed us up perfectly for the next part of our discussion. So let me first introduce Kate Kruger. Many of you know Kate. She was the co-editor with me of this New Directions for Evaluation issue. Kate is an advisor at PACT and will take us away with some trends and takeaways. So thank you, Kate.
Great. Thanks, Allison. And thank you very much, Tom, for those reflections. I think readers of this issue of New Directions for Evaluation will find that much of the evolution of the DRG sector is really mirrored in how the evaluation space has transformed as well. So realizing what we do and don't know about how to externally strengthen democratic institutions and actors has really coincided with major shifts in the assumptions that practitioners make about what effective monitoring and evaluation should actually look like. So with that in mind, I'll give you a little preview of this issue of New Directions for Evaluation and share some of the lessons that we've drawn from it. So this issue is focused on how DRG programs and evaluations have conceptualized and approached the issue of complexity. So that's complexity of program, context, politics, and measurement. Just kind of a lot. So rather than be prescriptive about what we meant by the term complexity, Allison and I, as editors, gave authors free rein to propose a topic that fit within that general framing because we really wanted to get a bottom-up approach to the state of the field and how folks are actually conceptualizing this in the real world. So based on the chapter submissions we received, we organized the issue into 3 sections. You'll also see a link in the chat, hopefully, to an overview of each chapter in the issue. And if it's not in the chat now, we'll make sure that it is later. So the first section introduces the democracy, rights, and governance sector, which faces, as Allison mentioned, some somewhat unique measurement challenges due to the inherently political nature of DRG programs. This section includes a historical perspective from evaluation implementers and grant makers on the evolution of DRG as a sector and its specific culture of evaluation in particular. Secondly, we introduce the conceptual challenges that accompany DRG evaluation. So that's the differing understandings of what can be measured in complex DRG programs, why, and how. So this section includes chapters that make the case for really seriously rethinking the role we play as evaluators. This means acknowledging our presence, acknowledging our power, and making epistemological and methodological decisions that are empowering, humanizing, and genuinely engage within existing political dynamics without accepting those political dynamics as an unquestioned good. That's a really difficult needle to thread, and there's some really great chapters grappling with this. So finally, the third section illustrates these conceptual challenges through practical examples of how evaluators have implemented complexity-responsive approaches in their work. So this section includes chapters that discuss the security implications of complexity-responsive evaluation, how adaptive management can facilitate more effective evaluation systems, and several case studies of programs that have employed a wide variety of methods to evaluate under really complex conditions. So with that issue structure in mind, I'll share with you a few of the takeaways that Allison and I gleaned from this issue from our role as editors. I, of course, encourage you to read the full issue and draw your own conclusions as well. So first of all, if you're wondering why I still haven't given you a clear definition of what I mean by the word complexity, that's kind of one of the takeaways. Complexity is defined and operationalized really differently by different actors within this sector that I'm going to loosely group into 3 different categories as I see them. So some evaluators see complexity as an environmental factor. So they'd put a real emphasis on MEL that can account for programmatic adaptation in the face of contextual shifts. The ability to shift what you're measuring quickly is the highest value. Other evaluators are more focused on complexity of causal processes, and thus they're emphasizing MEL systems that can account for emergence while still testing a coherent program theory. And then finally, some evaluators are really narrowing in on the complexity of the programming landscape itself, meaning issues of power and voice and how DRG programs are designed and awarded. And consequently, they're advocating for MEL systems that really recenter the evaluation experience towards intended beneficiaries and the communities that we're hoping will take something away from DRG programs. So perhaps it's clear that with these fairly disparate ways of operationalizing complexity, we're at a stage as DRG evaluators where there's genuine disagreement about what can and should be measured and how, and that this disagreement is exacerbated by a lack of conceptual clarity. So perhaps this sounds negative, but we'd argue that it's actually completely natural in the context of a decade-plus democratic recession, where many of the assumptions on how to support democracy and human rights that birthed this sector are now in question. Of course, we aren't sure of what to do. Wouldn't it be odder if we were? So what does this mean? What are we actually taking away from this issue, and what are the implications? From where we sit as editors of this issue, we're seeing lots of innovation, lots of creativity, and responsiveness to context that comes, at least partially, at the expense of generating evidence that's comparable across place and time. So, for example, we didn't receive any chapter submissions focusing on evaluations using experimental or quasi-experimental methods, probably in part because in this moment in the DRG evaluation space, those approaches are fairly rare. But we really see a need for a conversation about building more holistic MEL systems that can incorporate complexity-responsive approaches on the one hand, with robust theory testing on the other, and maintaining, either way, an overarching value that any and all approach should be understood, valued, and of true benefit to the intended beneficiaries above all. So to that end, our second takeaway is that program practitioners are dealing with complexity, however it is that they're defining it, by breaking down the barriers between evaluation and intervention. We're seeing an agreement across evaluators with really different epistemological and methodological priors that treating evaluation as though it can exist in full isolation from programming is impractical at best, and a recipe for irrelevant, extractive, or even harmful data collection at worst. DRG concepts really need to be operationalized locally, both for the purposes of measurement validity and to adhere to the participatory and democratic values that are widely prioritized by DRG evaluators today. So we're really inspired by the many examples in this issue of how evaluation is being treated as part of an intervention that can empower and support a program's goals. So, without further ado, let me introduce the authors and organizations we featured in this issue. We're only featuring 4 chapters today, as Allison noted, but I really want to emphasize that all 12 chapters are so worthwhile and each brings something unique to the table. And in addition to the 12 specific chapters, they reference like dozens of individual programs and stakeholders that were all really, really thoughtful in participating in this issue. So our objective in recruiting authors was to create a platform for a diversity of voices, both geographically and in terms of the role they play in the world of evaluation. So that's commissioners of evaluations, internal evaluators, external evaluators, and program staff. This was important to us because these are the people doing the real work, and yet there hasn't been a practitioner-focused DRG publication released by an AEA journal before this one. That said, you might see that DC is still overrepresented in this publication, and we have a long way to go in creating a space for real representation within the evaluation publication space. So this is just a small first step, and you should stay tuned for more. So now I will introduce the authors of the 4 chapters of NDE that we're featuring here today. To start us off, I'll hand it over to Allison to give you an overview of her chapter, which really serves as a frame for the rest of the issue. So take it away, Allison.
Thank you very much, Kate. Thank you, Kate. So I titled this first chapter, Politics is More Difficult Than Physics, Complexity and the Challenge of DRG Program Evaluation. The quote was supposedly said by the physicist Albert Einstein, who allegedly was suggesting that it was easier to understand the workings of the atom than to design a political system that prevented the atom from being weaponized. This is a pretty convenient metaphor for a chapter about the challenge of measuring political programming. In this chapter, I make 4 main points. First, that the political nature of DRG goals differentiates it from other development sectors, even though they have also come to deal with the political as they tackle ever more challenging problems. And Tom Carothers has written quite a lot about this in his co-authored book, Development Aid Confronts Politics. Second, the historical evolution of DRG program evaluation can be organized into 4 generations, and you will probably recognize yourself in them, and I will get to them momentarily. But overall has been marked by, first, a professionalization of the sector as a distinct practice area, and also debates over what can and should be achieved by DRG programs, which in turn impacts what can and should be measured, and vice versa. What we think can and should be measured has impacted what we think can and should be achieved. Third, complexity has come to dominate the field, though this concept has not been well specified, as Kate noted earlier. And fourth, we can operationalize complexity effectively, and I provide a framework for doing so, which builds on the lessons that have emerged in the evolution of DRG evaluation. So, what has been this evolution? I've divided the evolution into 4 generations, which once the slide advances, you should be able to see. I think it just takes a minute for things to update. There it is. There is a question mark at the end of the 4 generations because I fully expect and I hope that DRG evaluation will continue. Now, these generations summarize a lot of different actors and funders and perspectives and emerged after interviews and a literature review. You will no doubt have your own personal experiences and timelines, but hopefully the issues raised will resonate. The first generation of formal DRG aid, and I'm picking up some of what Tom was mentioning, this first generation really spanned the 80s and 90s. I call this the cowboy generation because of the general lack of oversight and limited playbooks that were being used by programs. This was a time when DRG was not a well-known sector, and therefore there was not much codification of theories, approaches, or practices. One of the interviewees said of the period, people didn't define change. It was just going to happen. The second generation really got going after 9/11, when funding for DRG increased exponentially, together with more oversight and much more partisan perspectives, as many of you will remember. Because DRG evaluators had not codified their own theories and practices, they tended to take on those of other sectors, which often did not fit well. At the same time, standardized metrics and instruments were introduced and encouraged, and evaluation suddenly became much more important. For example, many of you here on this call today will no doubt remember the Special Inspector General reports that highlighted critical limitations of DRG evaluation of the period. Because of this, many felt like one of the interviewees did, that all the attention on evaluation took away from the real work, and that consequently there was a ML tax. I call this the technocratic disenchantment because of the broken illusion that there was a simple technocratic fix for evaluation and the sector more broadly to very complex political challenges. The third generation was a messy middle, because on the one hand, there was a push to become much more technical, such as via experimental designs, as Kate mentioned. One interviewee said of the period, it was RCT's heyday and our mayday. This is a rather pervasive feeling, even though RCTs made up a tiny fraction of evaluation at the time. At the same time, there was a push in the opposite direction. DRG evaluators came to learn and embrace some of the uniqueness of their sector and homed in on the political nature of the work with a much greater focus on the importance of context. Rather than standardize and control, they pushed to experiment with other designs. And this paved the way for this current 4th generation, which has really focused on the complexity of DRG work. For some, this was an excuse for past failures. For others, a rallying call to innovate with new approaches, such as empowerment and democratic evaluation, approaches that use evaluation itself as an intervention in support of DRG goals, as Kate noted earlier, and the push to be more transformative through the act of evaluation. And my co-authors, Giovanni, Claudia, and Donna, will continue this theme in their presentations. Complexity has become much more of a common term. You don't need to search far to see it everywhere. But as a sector, we have struggled to make complexity operationally useful without losing the value of the concept and its large S. So I think the defining feature of this current generation may be how we figure out to work with complexity rather than constrain it. And as one interviewee said on this slide here, if evaluators just bring up dilemmas, this is hard to measure because it's complex, they won't get a lot of traction. So we have a real responsibility here. So how do we make complexity useful? To answer this, I build from the work of many great evaluators and thinkers, such as those listed on this slide, whom you will recognize. First, we need to ask, complexity of what? If we separate a program into its components and take a complex social systems approach, we can differentially assess complexity of the context, such as through a theory of context on the left I think this is your left, on the left of the screen, of the change that needs to happen. This is on my right of the screen, theory of change, and of the program strategies, which for all of us should be in the middle of the screen, the theory of action. I suggest that to determine what the best strategy is, for example, whether we should rely on best practice, good technical or social practice, or emergent practice, that we first need to assess the complexity of the theory of context and of the theory of change. I suggest using Michael Quinn Patton's understanding of complexity as a factor of disagreement over the problem. So do we even agree over what the problem is? And uncertainty over its solution. For example, is there an evidence cause-effect logic that can correct the problem? And using this, we can categorize complexity degrees using the Kneffin framework, which many of you know, of simple, complicated, complex, and chaotic. In this next visual, thank you very much, Kate, you will see a theory of context on my left, hopefully your left as well, and a theory of context, the theory of change along the bottom. If the theory of context has low disagreement, so it's clear what the problem is, and there's high certainty of the change that needs to happen, you'd fall on the bottom left quadrant. There, the suggested theory of action is simple or straightforward, and the advice for the theory of action is to use existing best practice. This is a situation where highly evidenced strategies do exist and should be used. By contrast, when you have high disagreement over the problem and high uncertainty over the solution, you're in the top right zone, the zone of complexity, where you would need emergent practice. This is a situation where there is no highly evidenced practice and you would need to test and assess constantly, much like in a developmental evaluation approach. So I suggest you can use this framework to help determine your program design, but also your monitoring, evaluation, and learning and adaptation systems, really tailoring the methods you use to that degree of complexity. Because a program can be complex in some aspects, but not in others. And understanding that difference helps decide things like how much adaptation should be expected, whether more emergent approaches are necessary. So that was a deep technical dive in a very short period. Of course, for a more complete explanation, I invite you to read the chapter or meet me for coffee. But I'll end here for now, and I look forward to future conversations. So over to you, Kate, with thanks.
Great. Thank you so much, Allison. And next, I'll introduce Giovanni Dazzo, who is an assistant professor at the University of Georgia, and most recently was at the U.S. State Department's Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. So take it away, Giovanni.
Thank you, Kate. So as you can see on the title of this slide, I was making the argument that in many cases, when we think about human rights evaluation, we actually lose sight of the human beings within this global system. And on the next slide, this article begins with a simple question. What evaluation criteria initiatives? So in this chapter, I argue that when we conduct evaluations of rights-based programs, we need to show how our evaluative approaches not only espouse human rights principles, but how our methodological decisions need to be assessed against these principles as well. So to provide examples of how this can be done, I then moved to a critical self-reflection of 3 human rights program evaluations I conducted over a 10-year period, showing how the evaluation approaches used may have hindered or promoted the dignity, liberty, and equality of program participants and myself as evaluator. And as you can see in the first point, these questions don't simply ask what we can do to work more closely and alongside participants, but also how we need to protect our own dignity, liberty, and equality as evaluators and participants within these systems. Now, one of the points that I bring up on this next slide is this idea of one's espoused theory versus those theories in use. And as I move to the examples within the case study, I document the mechanics behind one's methodological decisions in human rights program evaluation. So there's an opportunity to actually explore inconsistencies in espoused theories versus theories in use. The former being the theories that we document and explicitly state what we say we value, in this case, dignity, equality, and liberty, with the latter being those we actually perform, or in the case of evaluators, how our actions expose our implicit theories. In this case, whether our methodologies often blind us from our own values and principles. Now, on the next slide, the complexity within the human rights system is documented, but as you can see, this is one that evaluators must understand before they actually attempt to evaluate human rights programming. Also, this diagram shows a series of neat circular figures, but there's a complexity in this system due to the fact that particular human rights bodies can act in multiple capacities, complicating how one needs to consider the interrelationships and perspectives in this system, and the fact that many national governments behind this system have varying levels of democracy and may also be perpetrators of human rights abuses and actually seeking to disrupt this global system. Another point is that we often forget when trying to illustrate how human rights is based, that we leave out how national governments can help or hinder the process, and more so, the individuals and communities who are affected by these decisions. Now, in the next diagram, I consider how the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which I use to establish the criteria within this article, would need to be considered when we design and implement evaluations that promote dignity, liberty, and equality for and of participants. Now, this is especially important because within human rights programs, many participants have been subjected to violations and abuses of their dignity and liberty. So against these criteria, top-down evaluation approaches such as results-based management are often inappropriate or insufficient for the evaluation of rights-based programs. Now, in this diagram, I display the 3 evaluations I included in my case study and how they did or did not benefit by infusing rights-based principles within design and implementation. I start with the example of an evaluation with Indigenous communities in Cambodia, where the methods employed were top-down, designed without the culture of the communities in mind. These interviews and focus groups disregarded the communal nature of these communities, whereas moving to the example in Guatemala, we integrated culturally sustaining practices that drew on the oral traditions and storytelling of the Cachical Maya. And in effect, it improved the data we were able to obtain and to interpret alongside the Maya populations. Now, this evaluation following rights-based principles followed, just as Dr. Mertens explains in her work, whether we can work with communities to produce evaluations that are transformative. And in my own work, if working with those who have experienced rights abuses, understanding that our own work must not only be transformative, but also restorative. Through our methodological decisions, how do we restore the humanity and dignity of participants? Now, in the article, I conclude with 7 reflexive questions I've used in my own work, and these draw from my own field memos and notes. And it's a way to continue this dialogue, especially with those interested in integrating human rights principles in their own evaluation practice. Now, in the last question in this slide, I question whether we are invoking this blind deference to our typical ways of knowing or our epistemologies and how we've been trained to collect data, which may be extractive and reductive, especially for those who've been interrogated about their human rights violations that they've been subjected to. Now, in reflecting on DRG evaluation on the last slide, I do begin to question as we consider complexity, are we considering our principles and the cultures and principles of those we work with? This, of course, creates implications on top-down results-based management techniques, randomized control trials, but also whether our so-called participatory approaches are simply done for the sake of participation, essentially rendering them as a check-the-box exercise and co-opting them for our own purposes, or whether we are actually interrogating whether our practices are culturally responsive, equitable, transformative, and restorative, not only for participants within the global human rights system, but also ourselves. It all goes back to whether we are practicing the values and principles we espouse in our methodological decisions and literature, and whether we're considering our own power and privilege as evaluators.
Thank you so much, Giovanni. Really appreciate your presentation. All right. So now we will turn it over to Claudia Olavarria and Donna Mertens. Claudia is an independent evaluator and coordinator of the Network of Systematization, Monitoring, and Evaluation of Latin America and the Caribbean. And Claudia co-authored with Donna, who is the Professor Emeritus at Gallaudet University. Thank you both so much for being here. Take it away.
Many thanks, Kate. Good morning and good evening, everyone, and thank you all for joining us today. I just wanted to clarify that I do not coordinate RELAC, but I coordinate the Gender and Human Rights thematic interest group of that organization. A special thanks to all of you and to Alison and Kate for challenging us to share the learnings, and many thanks especially to Dr. Donna Mertens for her generosity to join me and her constant inspiration. We're sharing with you today a chapter titled Challenging Democracy, Human Rights, and Governance Evaluation Capacity Development Through a Transformative Lens. My name, as Kate said, is Claudia Olavarria, and I am working to strengthen evaluation capacities for individuals and organizations in Latin America and abroad. So today I'm here to share with you what I have learned in these past years, critically looking at my own practice with the help of Donna Mertens. Now I'll pass the microphone to Donna so she can introduce herself.
Hello, I'm Donna Mertens, and I am thrilled to be a co-author with Claudia. I am Professor Emeritus at Gallaudet University, a university for deaf people, and that was the place where I became consciously aware that the methodologies that we were using were not being responsive to the culture or the needs of the populations. And so when I was president of AEA in 1998, I had the theme Transforming Society Through Evaluation. And that pretty much encapsulates my 50 years of working in the evaluation field. So back to Claudia.
Many thanks, Donna. Well, in slide 2, regarding the abstract, I wanted to share with you that this chapter looks critically at previous consultancy work that was done by myself and my colleague Antonella Guidocchio. Back in 2019, the U.S. Department of State and Naval Partners funded the International Organization for Cooperation in Evaluation. That's a network of voluntary organizations for professional evaluators to create tools for DRG evaluation capacity development in order to strengthen its practice worldwide. 2 tools were developed back then, an online course for evaluators that was translated to 3 languages, and a toolkit for voluntary organizations for professional evaluation. Both tools aim to strengthen DRG evaluation practice and at the same time advocate for more DRG evaluation in different contexts in different parts of the world. This because all these organizations work globally with networks of evaluators. The design process of these tools was based on experiences, lessons learned from evaluation teams and DRG experts from different parts of the world that were collected by the consultancy team in order to build consensus about the scope and the content that they should address. While developing the tools, we found out that capacity development for DRG evaluation using this global scope faces diverse challenges, and after a critical analysis, we are convinced that these challenges can be better addressed using the transformative paradigm, and that's what we're talking to you about today, in order to increase the coherence and put into value the relevance of the work and its transformative goals. So now, with the next slide, I will hand it out to Donna so she can go a little bit deeper in that transformative paradigm proposal.
Okay, First, I congratulate Claudia because this really is a meta evaluation, and it's something that we evaluators are called upon to do. And yet it's not something that appears frequently in the literature. So I think this critical reflection on what if we had used a transformative lens in the work that we do is really important. I see a natural connection between DRG and transformation because we've heard that word from all of the other speakers, because it was designed specifically to be applied within contexts of fragility and diversity and complexity. And if we look at what we're being called upon through the UN SDGs and the worldwide agreement that we should have these goals of increasing equity and democracy, then we're looking for a theoretical lens that will guide our methodological decision making. And so that's what the transformative lens adds. It adds that conscious, explicit focus on equity and justice and responsiveness to culture and context. It explicitly says we need to integrate community-based knowledge and the inclusion of marginalized voices. We need to critically assess those power structures and challenge an oppressive status quo. And we need our data and our processes to provide a basis for transformative action to increase social, economic, and environmental justice and enhance human rights. So I will turn it back to Claudia to explain more about what she saw as the importance of bringing a transformative lens to DRG capacity development.
Many thanks, Donna. Well, when we work in developing capacities for evaluators, we often put much time and effort in reflections about the methods and the tools. But we do not put enough time, or at least we didn't put enough time, often in the conceptual and epistemological and axiological assumptions of our own practice. So where are we standing to do this evaluation? What point of view are we using? What's my history and what's my position in order to take the definitions I need to take to evaluate? So regarding this, there were mainly 4 challenges that we faced that I will just let you know very quick, that could be better addressed using the transformative paradigm. The first of them is defining DRG evaluation, because addressing what DRG evaluation is and what is not, and building consensus about what is key to define its scope and to clarify what voices or definitions will be at the base of the capacity development strategy is very key. And it's very key in light of power dynamics and the role that these power dynamics play in knowledge production and its legitimacy in different settings. So we need to clarify and work very deep in listening to diverse voices, including those of marginalized communities and of different stakeholders involved in each context that we're working in. The second challenge is how to use a global capacity development strategy for addressing context and complexity responsive evaluation needs. Meaning, how can a single and not flexible training strategy be useful for evaluators needing to address evaluation challenges with tailored methodological strategies? The third challenge is what evaluation approaches and methods should be integrated or highlighted in a training effort in order to give a set of tools that is flexible and wide enough to address complex evaluation needs in those different contexts that I just told you about. And regarding this, the learning resources for flexible and adaptive decision makings are also very key. So if we go to the next slide to wrap up because of the time, it's very important to share that even though the products were very robust and commissioners and participants were satisfied with them, we believe that they, as well as other strategies to develop DRG evaluation capacities, could greatly benefit by using the transformative paradigm as a lens to look at the evaluation practice and its use from our own position. So the transformative paradigm as a guide for developing DRG evaluation capacities has the potential to increase its coherence and alignment towards transformative purposes of DRG evaluation mainly by three strategies. First is allowing the sense-making in the DRG evaluation practice under its explicit assumption that evaluations strive to achieve social justice and the realization of human rights. Second, it explicitly addresses the importance of incorporating the voices of marginalized communities as a key part of the evaluation process. And third, the transformative paradigm contributes to a better understanding of the DRG evaluation practice and its need to be responsive to complexity, to cultural context and power dynamics, as well as technically robust. So just to finalize, and the last slide, in a multiple crisis scenario where more and better DRG evaluation is needed, in order to achieve this, local evaluators with appropriate competency sets are required. So this need to develop capacities for evaluators is more relevant in fragile, conflicted, or violent contexts in which DRG evaluators have an increased potential to be change agents towards stronger democracies and the fulfilling of human rights. An appropriate competency set relates to the capacity to evaluate in a way that's responsive to power dynamics and a culture, gender, territory, and history of communities, as well as technically robust, as I just shared with you. And finally, the DRG evaluation capacity development should then strengthen the capacity of evaluators to make informed, responsive, and adaptive decision-making, to evaluate in complex context and contribute to transformation from their own practice. So the use of transformative paradigm allows addressing these challenges with a coherent, comprehensive, and transformation-oriented framework. That's all on my side. Thank you.
Thank you so much to Claudia and Donna. That was great. And last, but definitely not least, I'll introduce Elena Rabi and Roland Kovacs, who are respectively the Senior Officer and Chief of Party of the USAID Engage activity based in Ukraine. Elena and Roland, take it away.
Thanks, Kate, and all for featuring our chapter in Ukraine today. I'll start and then pass to Roland, and now let's jump to the next slide. So I'd like to start mentioning that initially we planned to submit to the special issue a completely different chapter, focusing on our experience in utilizing a complex approach for assessing civil society reform coalitions in Ukraine. But with the start of unjustified Russian invasion of Ukraine, we agreed with guest editors to focus instead on the lived experiences of Ukrainian evaluators working in conditions of humanitarian and other types of crisis, being at personal, physical risks themselves. The article arguments are based on 8 structured interviews with the male professionals in Ukraine. And in general, the chapter reflects on how Ukrainian evaluators were working on pre-invasion and the pivots they took post-invasion. Let me briefly describe the main findings. First of all, male professionals appeared to be relatively prepared to the war challenges, and ironically, this was possible due to the COVID pandemic. It paved the way for a relatively smooth adaptation to wartime operations. Another point is that the monitoring became to be at the forefront of adaptive programming nowadays, and link between male and decision-making has become even closer. The principle of minimizing harm to people remains the most crucial for evaluators in Ukraine. This is the main principle all here must adhere to, even if the accuracy and speed of data collection are affected. Another crucial conclusion is that ACT, categorize and respond management approach proved its effectiveness and was used extensively by Ukrainian civil society organizations. One can say that Ukrainian civil society played a crucial functional and problem-solving role, acting as a complementary informal institution during the first months of the war. In particular, it's complemented or even in some cases substituted the governmental functions, given the opportunity for the state to catch up on this later. Lastly, interviewed evaluators stated that the war is not just an excuse for any harm to democracy in Ukraine. Democratic values, human rights, and principles of good governance must not take a time out, even during the martial law. From this perspective, the role of evaluators and watchdog institutions is becoming especially important. And here I pass the floor to Roland.
Yes, thanks, Elena. I would, first of all, like to thank everyone for joining today and listening to us. And a special shout out to everyone who are in Ukraine, because our work, Olena's work, wouldn't have happened without those people who stayed and remained to closely follow programming activities and try to draw conclusions for future. I also wouldn't want to run through all the bullet points that's on the slide. You will, I'm sure, have the slides. I'd rather just like to highlight a couple of sort of self-critical points that, listening to you earlier, I think dovetails with the learnings that we have. And one and critical one, and I guess this is important at times of war, but not just at times of war, is really the need for being able to provide, gather real-time data. In times of war, for certain, but in many social movements and in social conflicts, it's crucial that the information is not exposed, not 6 months or 12 months after a project or a program has been happening, but really is real time, and it then helps to make programmatic decisions, perhaps even make some hard choices based on that. This also, I think, underlines that given this really fluid environment where we don't know where the front lines are from one day to another, what we would call in Ukraine newly liberated areas, or the newly liberated areas or newly liberated areas, we are permanently in the need of looking at the larger context, and in the Ukraine case, it's clearly DRG context, but it's more than DRG context. In our case, it's a hugely military context, important infrastructure and economic context, and lastly, I think here is the one point that I will underline is that those who are in these hard-to-reach communities, marginalized individuals whose voices are not heard in the daily noise of social media and media reporting, those are actually the ones who are the most affected by the war. Those are the ones whose well-being, livelihoods, and really lives are at stake. And I believe we do not have, as DRG practitioners, methods, tools to be permanently, constantly holding their hands and hearing their voices, which will inform our programming. And I think in sort of future programming and designing for MEL, I think these are some of the key and underlining factors that we will have to take into account.
Thank you both so much, Elena and Roland. We really appreciate you making the time to participate here today. And to all of our authors, I think you'll all agree that this was a really interesting presentation. There's more where that came from in the full issue. So again, I want to plug you reading the entire thing. And now I'll pass it back to Caroline, who is a senior governance officer here at PACT, who has generously volunteered to facilitate our question and answer session. Take it away, Caroline.
Thanks, Kate. Hi, all. Great to be with you. Again, huge congratulations on the issue and much gratitude to each of the presenters for your great and engaging presentations this morning. Just to move us into the kind of question and answer session, I'm going to post in the question and answer thread the guidance for some of this question and answer together. As Allison noted, the chat is muted for this webinar, but the question and answer thread that you should see at the top of your screen is very much alive and active. So there are two ways that you can ask a question. You can absolutely feel free to ask a question in the question and answer thread by typing directly. You're also welcome to raise your hand if it's easier for you to, or if you're on a mobile device and can't quite type your question. We will take a combination of questions from the question and answer thread as well as from those who raise their hands. The only final piece I would offer is that if you are raising your hand, once we call on you, there will be a small lag as I work to unmute you individually to ask your question. So there will be just maybe 20 seconds or so before you can formally unmute. If you do have a question for a specific presenter, please feel free to note that either as you type or as you offer your question. Otherwise, we will direct the question for you if it is more general to the presenter or range of presenters. So I will pause there and I'm happy to start taking questions. Thanks. Okay, so I'm going to start. I see one raised hand, and then I will go back to the question and answer thread. So Brett, I'm going to unmute you right now, and you should be able to unmute in T-minus 10 seconds to ask your question. All right, go for it.
Great, thank you. Can you hear me?
I can, thanks.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Kate and Allison, for putting this together, and thanks to the presenters for some really interesting food for thought here. I wanted to ask a sort of general question. It's kind of inspired by Kate's comments early on the sort of complementarity between complexity on one hand and another impulse that we're hearing in the evaluation field, which is toward rigor, right? And testing. Right. So, yeah, I think in a perfect world, we could have both of those things, but we live in a world of scarce resources. So complementarity is tough, right? That's a trade-off. When you're doing sort of complexity and adaptation on one hand, maybe you're sacrificing, some of that ability to kind of set up a test beforehand and see what the data say about that test, right? So I'm just curious to hear kind of folks' thoughts about navigating that trade-off for evaluators and implementers that are working with scarce resources and on sort of limited timelines. I mean, are there technical areas or program approaches that lend themselves to more flexibility and adaptation? Are there different comparative advantages for different actors within the DRG sector or something else? So just really curious to hear your thoughts on navigating that trade-off. Thanks again.
Sure. I can start for the time being. Can everyone hear me? Okay, great.
I can.
I think the first thing to keep in mind with your question, thank you for that question. It's something I think about a lot too. I think the first thing is that the world of DRG, and this is something that Allison addresses in her chapter, there are approaches that are very new and innovative that aren't particularly well evidenced in terms of DRG interventions. And then there are theories of change that we have worked through many times and pretty robustly, but just haven't necessarily like stockpiled the evidence effectively. So in those contexts of program approaches that you kind of know what the model is going to look like, even if the context might not be as conducive as you would hope, I think that's where we can have some space to insert some of those robust methods without necessarily compromising the experience of the intended beneficiaries. They're maybe a little bit more flexible, a little more open to trying new ways of measurement. And it may, in fact, be like something refreshing and new that's adding value to their experience too, which again is a really important framework. On the other hand, in conflict settings, in rapid response settings, those are the places where I think that keeping kind of our feet really solidly in the more like complexity responsive and adaptive evaluation systems is just simply more practical. Because I think if you try to set up any more simplified theory or rigorous comparison, it'll just probably fall apart pretty quickly. So I think that categorizing the complexity of our program contexts before we determine like what methodological approach might be more useful would be a good first step. And that's something that I don't think we've actually done very clearly. I think Allison's chapter sort of starts that, but there's a long way to go. And then the second step is working with the groups of intended beneficiaries that we want to support in a given program and see how they feel and what they want to know and how they want to know it. Because I think that sometimes we have assumptions. Giovanni, briefly alluded to this at the end of his presentation. We have assumptions about what participatory evaluation approaches look like, and that people will all want to respond in a particular kind of way. But in fact, people might be craving different kinds of evidence themselves from where they sit and may or may not want to be involved in how that evidence gets gathered. So I think we need to categorize what these interventions look like and grapple a lot more seriously with what it means to be participatory to move forward and prioritize accordingly. I don't know if that totally answered your question, but maybe partially. We'll see if there are other answers too.
I also disabled his mic, so he's not going to be able to tell you that fully or partially answered this question. Thanks again, Brett, for your question. Donna, would you like to add to that or respond further, or is there a separate question that you have?
Now, I just wanted to say that as evaluators, we also need to critically assess the meaning of rigor and the meaning of being responsive, and that we can actually be more rigorous in what we do if we are answering questions about what is needed right now based on an understanding of the culture and context. And so while there is a historical meaning to rigor in evaluation, if we critically analyze the meaning of that, we can answer the questions that need to be answered using the methods that are appropriate within that context and being responsive and inclusive in the way that we do our work, and through that strategy, then we can actually provide more valid information that can serve as a basis for decision making. So I'll end at that.
Thanks very much to both Kate and Donna for their reflections there. And again, Brett, thanks so much for kicking us off with that question. I do see one additional question in the chat from Talda that I will just read to offer. So this says, what are the MEL kind of thoughts and reflections on the difficulty of linking results to actions? Often, results are achieved by complex actions and not necessarily one program or project, or sometimes by catalyst events that feed on years of work by DRG programming. So how do we kind of understand some of these difficulties of linking results to actions?
I'm going to suggest that Roland and Elena take that question as they're in the midst of this very challenge currently. So if you wouldn't mind, Roland and Elena, taking us away. Great question.
Sure. I don't know, Elena, would you like to take the first stab at it?
Probably after you. Please start.
Okay, sure. I actually think that, first of all, it's an awesome question. I think this really goes back to Tom's initial thoughts, is that what is that we know? We think we just need to provide knowledge. We have the puzzles of a democratic system. So we set them as goals, deliverables, new constitution, legal reforms, etc. And then results will follow, or actually impact of that will follow. We're sitting in 2023 and understand that that really is not the case. So in our programmings, and I think this is true for most USAID programmings, the trajectories are long term, and they, in most CDCS that I have seen, it underlines that there's a snapshot, a period of time in which an intervention or another operates, but the impact is really expected on a longer term. So what I'm trying to argue here is that and I think that's what PACT really tries to do is set the expectations in the in-between and actually in the outcome level as much as possible. Try to avoid to work toward checkboxes and basic outputs, but also we can see the future and the systems are so complex really is that we make an intervention on one will have eventually a butterfly effect elsewhere, but really we cannot see how the whole system will react and what will be ultimately the impact. So we're trying to be focusing on these outcome levels, and I think that is how the donor, which in our case is USAID and US government in most cases, looks at development now in 2023.
And let me also probably provide you a practical example of our work conditional system. So when speaking about our partners, civil society organizations, their planning horizon narrowed greatly during the first half year of the war, and they redirected their efforts completely towards humanitarian support, for example. It had actually little to do with any DRG, such as procuring goods for army needs or assisting in the evacuation of civilians, but still it was easily to track these results to actions provided by our partners, and we were able to easily calculate the number of people assisted in their difficult situation. So we are trying to deal with it, and it was quite successful. And also let me highlight the very important findings. As of now, we see that almost all our partners, civil society organizations, they mostly return to their core missions and continue to work on their tasks which are very strategic, and all this their previous small system are in place already. They are back. Thank you.
Thanks so much for those reflections, both. Denise, I see your hand raised. I'm going to unmute you now. So I think in a few seconds, you should be able to offer your question. Go for it. Denise, I can't hear you. Do you want to try offering your question once more? Okay, so I think we're running into a small technical difficulty. I'm going to keep your mic enabled, Denise, in case there's something that shifts on your side. And I can certainly take your question on chat, or we can loop back if maybe we just need another minute or two for troubleshooting on that piece. Happy to take another question either through raised hand or through the Q&A function while we wait on Denise's question. All right, go ahead, Mason. I'm going to unmute you now. Okay, go ahead. Okay, I am not hearing
Sorry
Mason's
there.
question.
Okay, I think
I'm
no,
go ahead.
now.
Sorry. Yep, go ahead.
Thank you. The presentations have been fantastic. One question that I have is that some of the conversation in terms of the practical conversation, I can really envision how we approach kind of questions of complexity within projects or activities. One challenge seems to be, how do we integrate more nuanced and complex information into the complex bureaucracies of donors? And I'm just interested in hearing whether there are any thoughts in terms of how our donors or even large implementing organizations can be better at absorbing some of the more nuanced approaches to information gathering, to make sense of that, to make decisions, If anybody has thoughts on that, that would be, I would appreciate that.
Well, thank you, Mason, for the incredibly challenging question. We're all sort of pausing here to figure out if someone else will take the plunge. I will note that we do have some funders who are chapter authors, but I will not do them the disservice of calling on them to answer a tough question. I will say that I think we would all agree that all of us in the system of DRG and evaluation have a responsibility in all of this. As implementers have a certain responsibility and a certain opportunity, as do evaluators. We all have sort of limitations and opportunities for what we can do. And I think a lot of the challenge now is being able to embrace complexity in a system where you are, for many of us, are limited by contractual or grant requirements and obligations. And even our funders are also restricted by what they can and cannot do for various reasons around the system. And so I will not promote a system revolution at this moment officially. However, I do think things have to shift, and some structural changes have to happen to enable this to be really, really embraced. Now, certainly some organizations have much more flexibility in what they can and cannot do. And so I think they are at an advantage in the situation, but also would welcome other thoughts on this, as I probably have fumbled my way through an answer without calling on anyone specifically. Anyone else? Giovanni and Roland, please jump in here, save me.
Sure. I'm happy to speak from my previous experience working in a funding organization where I led the Research and Evaluation Unit at the State Department's Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor Bureau. So I would say one thing that's often clear is that there still is an uneasy power dynamic and differential between implementing partners and donors. So much so that there are so many assumptions that practitioners or implementing partners take in their own work, and they simply don't ask simple questions. On the other hand, funders could do a better job, of course, of simplifying what they are asking for. I will promote a system revolution because now I'm in this comfortable seat of academia. But of course, as many of you who know me, I did so at DRL and often got called out on it. So I think we all need to promote system revolutions, because without so, we're simply holding on to the safety and privilege of our own positions. And without any type of systemic change toward calling on the potential inefficiencies and let's say inequities that can be harbored in contracts versus grants. The variable inflexibility within contracts, of course, so it's starting to push funders more toward open grant making as opposed to these contracts that are quite limiting in what you can do and who you can work with and which ideas you can promote. And there is, I would say, a lot of empty language these days on decolonizing aid or decolonizing DRG, but you can't do so without advocating for systemic changes on who is doing the work and why we're doing the work. So I would say we do need to have these frank discussions. And also we have to start to consider, do we want to take money from funders who are promoting essentially systems that are simply going to continue, I would say, to not promote democratization or the rights of individuals, and are solely in it for promoting the principle of keeping the work going within the organizations that can do it the most efficiently, and often for profit. So I'll end there, but thank you. I also take it as an extreme compliment that Donna Mertens is actually physically clapping. So thank you, Dr. Mertens.
Thanks, Giovanni, for saying what many of us have a hard time saying from our other seats. We need to wrap up, but Roland, did you want to jump in with a final comment on that topic? Your hand is raised. Was that a legacy hand?
Sure. I don't want to over dominate, but I just thought that, the question was a bit pessimistic and coming from maybe some bitter masculine. But I actually want to say that I think when it comes to U.S. government is way ahead than the rest of the world in these issues. I did hear earlier Tom saying that there is a revolution of evaluation happening now, so maybe we don't have to promote it anymore. It's just happening anyways. When it comes to who makes the decisions, I think the US government has been way ahead than, say, its European partners. It's not anymore just the lawyers and the institutional builders when it comes to the US government. And clearly, when it comes to talking about social justice and democracies that deliver, Tom noted at the beginning too that there's a lot of thinking on the relationship between the political economy and democracy and administrator powers. Recent piece in Foreign Affairs magazine, I think, makes even stronger the case for that DRG programming is about social justice. So I think the USG and your side of the pond, you should also all be proud.
Thanks, Roland. I love ending on a more optimistic note, so I really appreciate that. We are going to commit to ending on time. Let me just wrap up with first a thank you to everyone for the discussion. We will, if you are willing to share your questions and your name and email with us, we will respond via email for those whose questions we couldn't get to. We're very happy to do so. Also, I want to first provide a couple of things. One is I'm going to launch a word cloud prompt for you right now. The prompt is what do you think we as a sector need to know more about to advance DRG evaluation? Go ahead and pop in your thoughts there. The team webinars platform is not complexity adaptive at all. So stick to 1 or 2 words max is my recommendation in order to get your answer in there. So go ahead and add in your responses. It'll help us. I'm just curious what people think. We're also going to include a link to a webinar questionnaire feedback form. And many of us are evaluators, so we'd really appreciate your feedback on this event. So thank you for that. And on the screen, you'll see some QR codes with more resources on where to access the journal article and more information about the authors. So while we're doing that, let me just share a couple final thoughts just to end and on a high note. The first is, how do we, these are questions that have emerged as priorities given this discussion that I've been taking notes as we've been talking. The first thing that emerged is, how do we build opportunities for more DRG actors to be published? Many DRG actors and evaluators work in closing civic spaces. It can be very hard to encourage people to write about real issues they're dealing with in a very frank manner. And of course, the publishing timeline and the necessary time commitment can be extremely daunting, as all the authors of this issue can attest to. There's a strong research presence in DRG. We've seen the wonderful evidence gap maps and things like that. But I think we are really missing the voices of those in the thick of things. So a great encouragement to figure out that challenge. The second is, how do we embrace complexity while also building and testing parsimonious theories for learning? Brett kind of flagged that in his question earlier. There are some promising methods that have recently been introduced to DRG, like qualitative comparative analysis, QCA, and process tracing, but we definitely need to explore these further. To me, it sometimes feels like we have a limited set of options despite the methodological diversity out there. And third and finally, how do we ensure that these methodological advancements also advance a transformative approach, an evaluation as intervention approach, which puts beneficiaries and communities at the center and in the driving seat? And Laura Adams had a great question earlier about how do we also do so given the limitations and constraints of participation often and the burden on communities. So on that note, I'm seeing some wonderful word cloud responses. So please continue to share those. Let me thank our panelists ever so much for their time, for their commitment, and for their attention today. And to our authors who put in such great effort for this special issue. Please go out and look for it, or email me if you're curious about a specific chapter. And also thank you to our audience for a wonderful discussion and your generosity with your time today. So we hope to have more discussions, and I will officially end this. Have a wonderful day, and thank you again.